Okay, welcome everyone to Rangjung Yeshe Institute guest lecture featuring Dr. Gregg Kinkley from the University of Hawaii. Uh, so Professor Kinkley, prior to receiving his PhD from the University of Hawaii Linguistics Department in 1984, Gregg had spent much of his time at the University of Hawaii Indo-Pacific Languages Department, where he studied Chinese, Japanese, Burmese, Thai, Khmer, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Pali, Hawaiian, even Arabic, the list goes on. Upon graduation, he embarked on a long and torturous road as an attorney, first in Chicago and finally returning to Honolulu in 1990. During that 40-year odyssey-like detour in the legal world, he nevertheless continued his studies in Sino-Tibetan historical comparative linguistics and also developed an interest in the interface between law and language, specifically a comparative study of how cultures derive their legal systems from sacred texts. Currently teaching an introductory course in classical Tibetan at the University of Hawaii with the Department of Religions and Ancient Civilizations, he has also broadened his investigations into the comparative syntax of modern Tibeto-Burman languages, particularly those using arrays of copular verbs to express tense, aspect, mood, and evidentiality. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gregg Kinkley, who is also a student in the summer program at RYI. So student and professor, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. If you people would like to move further back, that would be okay. Oh, no, just kidding. I always wanted to hear someone say that. There was a commercial enterprise back at the turn of the century. It may still be in business, I'm not sure, called Successories. Their whole business model was to print posters with engaging pictures on them and some sort of mantra-like slogan underneath that would inspire people. So an accessory for success. See what they did there? So it was more remembered for the companies that made fun of them, however. So one was, you've probably seen this one. You probably haven't seen any of theirs, but you've seen the ones they made fun of. One was this little kitty hanging on this branch, looking like it was about to die. And underneath it said, hang in there. Okay. Well, another one that I remember very well was a picture of an NBA basketball player with a towel around his neck down like this in total despair. And the rousing message underneath is, what if your only purpose in life was to serve as a warning to others? Insert applause here. Okay, yes. So my odyssey tonight may be nothing more than serving as a warning to others. So, take this in any way you want to. But my familiarity with linguistics and my ability to see it maybe a little more clearly, at least as far as I'm concerned, from my perspective, was heightened by the fact that I was out of it for 40 years. Some say I'm still out of it. And that's really the burden of this message tonight is what I think is right and mostly wrong with linguistics. So if there's anyone out there thinking, gee, I really want to be a linguist, a lot of people want to do that, of course. There's big money in linguistics, as you all know. Now there's the laugh. I say yes. Yeah, that's that's why I became a lawyer for 40 years. The other challenge of this talk this evening is I was trying to pitch it to the audience, so linguistics, particularly theoretical linguistics that I did can be pretty dry. And here we have really a bunch of intellectuals who know much about philosophy and Buddhism and different languages. I was really wondering what I could talk about. So I first thought about perhaps describing a Buddhist theory of Tibetan grammar. And all I could come up with was that all Tibetan grammar is suffering. Just kidding. Yes. Oh, he likes that. All right. So on with the show. grammar. What is grammar anyway? Well, I'm always want to go into etymologies, probably to a fault because I was a historical linguist, or maybe an hysterical one, but also historical. And grammar obviously comes from the root there, gram or gramma, right, to write. So it has something to do with writing, but we know it has much more to do with things rather than just writing. I think it is interesting for you to know, and you'll think I'm kidding, but I'm not, that it's directly related to the word glamour. Because obviously, grammar is a glamorous thing, isn't it? But the root was that it was things written down and spoken that gave certain magical power. So the person with this magical power had a certain aura around them. And then that became, with centuries of misuse, what the term glamour is today. So that's a positive thing about grammar. Anyway, it's glamorous by etymology. Now, my I guess to give the setting, I have to tell you that I'm here sort of as a broken man. I was a baby boomer, still am a baby boomer. And I think those terms where you, subject to correction, I'm sure someone out there knows better than I, but it seems like they didn't start naming generations until they named the baby boomers, and then they went backwards and named the other ones, just like the Dalai Lamas and the Karmapas. But when I was growing up, my understanding was my generation was from 1948 to 1954, because those were the interwar years where the reproduction rate went way up. But I understand it's all the way out to 1964 now. The problem with that is that the people born in 48 and the people born in 64 are just led completely different lives than the people in the middle, which is me. It was bad timing. One good timing was I was too young for the Vietnam War, so that was good. I was able to experience rock and roll before it decayed into disco. That was good. And then only to watch it come back again. I mean, please, let's get original, folks. Really. But where it hurt me the most was in linguistics, because I had decided for some reason that I was always interested in linguistics, even before I knew what it was, which probably helped my interest. And the problem is that modern linguistics really was nearly invented. If we put the term modern American linguistics on it, it was really invented around 1957. And by the mid 60s, it had enjoyed a rise in celebrity that made it like the thing to learn, the thing to do. As a matter of fact, in my seventh grade English class, our grammar book was called English Syntax, and it was a Chomskyan transformational grammar of English. I guarantee you, none of those books are still in print, and no one would even dream of having a native speaker learn their own language through Chomsky's Byzantine apparatus. It's really pretty absurd. But that shows you the Kool-Aid effect, right? Everyone gets on the bandwagon pretty soon. Oh, yeah, this is really cool. Let's do transformational grammar. So because I was in that time zone, that delicate little railway car between the caboose and the engine of understanding what the science of language is all about, I really had unusual expectations. I figured that I knew everything that was going to happen in linguistics. It was going to be fun. And then the whole world changed. So no one does anything that I do anymore, basically. And, maybe that's a good thing. But the Chomskyan revolution, which more or less really defined linguistics and in a narrow regard still does, started decaying around the mid 70s. There's actually a Wikipedia article called Linguistic Wars that covers this very well. I didn't believe there'd be such a thing, but there is. Like so many prophets, he had an array of about four of his doctoral students who were all adlatuses of his. They all turned against him, went to different universities, Chicago, Stanford. Always have to have Chicago, right? And Harvard. And they started going against his gospel. So What was interesting to me was, though, on a personal level, when I was forced to leave linguistics because, yes, there were no jobs in it, and started in my law career, 40 years later, when I came back to linguistics, I had found to my shock that theoretically speaking, there was lots of movement, but absolutely no progress. I could have just picked up where I left off, and indeed to some extent did, and no one would have noticed because although there are many different competing theories of language and of grammar, none of them have been successful. As a matter of fact, the only grammar in terms of a rule-driven process of accounting for grammatical utterances is Paanini's grammar, I have a feeling, which is rather ironic since it was probably also the first. But I'm not sure I want to call that a grammar, or maybe I do want to call it a grammar, but I'm not sure I want to call what it describes a language. But we'll get into that later. I love Sanskrit, by the way, just in case there's anyone out there listening. So, at the end of it all, and being able to see it from a slightly, I won't fool you and say unbiased view, but from a more remote view, what I came to realize is that the problem with linguistics, and also the reason it never really changed that much, had a lot to do with their own scientific quest for understanding what truth is. They were looking for the truth of language. And as all you Buddhists know, there are two truths. And they were going for the conventional truth, not the absolute truth. And the conventional truth can be pretty misleading, but also interesting. And it's probably pretty much where I have to live. So there you go. Okay, let's take you quickly through the history of linguistics. Linguistics started, I would say, as philology. Philology is a Greek term meaning languages are cool. So if you liked doing languages, and especially written languages, you were a philologist. As you know, the etymology implies it's love of words, right? So that was fine, and that's probably where I've been for most of my life anyway. But things needed to move on if it was going to ever become a science, but we'll re-examine what the word science means in a minute too. So over the next few hundred years or so, depending how far you want to go back, people, particularly British people, because they were colonists and went to far-flung places like India, began to notice strange things like, oh, this odd language they speak in this place far away has names for mother and father that sound very much like our names for mother and father. You think they might be related languages? So this was a revolution. And this was like the 1700s. Okay, so just like galaxies weren't really discovered until the 1900s, the fact that there was an Indo-European language family wasn't really known until probably the late 1700s. So they didn't really know what to do with that. It was more curiosity than anything, but they developed word lists, vocabulary lists, and saw how these things were arranged, and they thought that was really cool. They probably came up with their own anthropological explanations based on race because, again, they were colonialists. But then, after a while, people with a little more scientific bent started to notice that there were recurrent systematic sound correspondences between these languages, like the M for mother in Sanskrit is also the M for the mother in English, or that the D in German for dick, meaning thick, is the th in English for thick. And they started noticing, oh, there's actually a system to this. This is when language study started to become scientific, because you could advance a theory like, oh, okay, I guess every time there's a D in German, there's a TH in English. And then you go about seeing if that's always true, or only sometimes true, or some true in some contexts, but not in others, or perhaps totally false. It doesn't matter. As long as you put that idea forth and then try to falsify it, you're doing science. So that was sort of the dawn of science. Once this started, of course, all hell broke loose. There were all sorts of mini spring-offs of different kinds of linguistics. There were these odd group of fellows called the young grammatikers, the sort of like the Young Turks, but they're for studying grammar, who were very sure that the real rules of language admitted of absolutely no exceptions. So their motto was, no exception without a rule. So, you have to admire them. That's a very strong hypothesis. You'll notice there are no books by the young grammatikers still in print, and that tells you pretty much what happened to their idea. But it's science. It postulated a theory and then disproved it. But what did come from that sort of womb of different ideas about how to make the study of language systematic was the Prague School of Linguistics. And Prague, of course, is a well-known intellectual capital. They were famous for defenestrations. I always thought that was pretty cool. But started the 30 Years' War. But they came with two insights that really probably go back to Ferdinand de Saussure and were taken over by the Prague School later. The first idea is one of markedness, and the other is about distinctive features. So markedness at the 50,000-foot level just means that any feature of a language has two sides to it, a marked state and an unmarked state. So an unmarked state is the way it would be without any other outside forces acting on it. And the marked state would be when something has happened to it. An example, a very gross example, would be plural in English. You have mark, and the plural would be marks. You have bed, and the plural would be beds. Okay, because you're scientific and you want rules, your rule is that the plural in English is accomplished by putting the sound s after the word. Mark plus s equals marks. But unfortunately, of course, bed plus s makes beds. And we don't say that, we say beds, right? So they say, okay, well, S is the unmarked form. That's the normal form. And then it goes to Z. Okay, whether you think this makes sense or whether it's arbitrary, why don't they make it be Z and go to S? And I know you can all see the assimilation of voicing that's involved there. That's fine. But the point is, what they've decided to do is started to construe rules and describe grammar through the prism of dualistic thinking. They came up with features which were always perforce plus or minus. Never 3, never 0, always 2, never 1, just always 2. So you could talk about voicing. So d is voiced. Sorry, it's unvoiced, obviously also aspirated, I guess. But so you don't talk about, well, okay, let's do that. You have t and t, d and d. You have to get outside of English for this. You could do Sanskrit for this. So those aren't 4 different sounds. Those are a battery of positive and negative sounds. So t is minus voice, minus aspirate. TH, t, is minus voice plus aspirate, and so on. You all know this because half of the people in the room know Sanskrit or some other language that uses the same system, as Tibetan at least used to. So, I mean, used to systematically. It has a different series. So this was the big insight that actually never really left the modern science of language. And I think I can use this term advisedly, reduction of all linguistic phenomenon to matrices of positive and negative features. This is the distinctive feature theory of the Prague School. And again, we've never gotten past it. This idea of setting up these signposts of plus minus features for articulation or for syntax for that matter defined honestly, in the mid 20th century, in the late 20th century, linguistics' greatest accomplishments, and I'm very serious about that, and also some of its deepest failures, but it has never gotten past that. So in 1968, there was a book written by our favorite Noam Chomsky and Morris Halla, The Sound Patterns of English, that actually gave a reasonably accurate predictive grammar of the phonology of English using these plus and minus features. Now, why did they do phonology when we all know we're talking about grammar tonight, and grammar is so much more interesting? Syntax is so much more interesting, right? Well, there's a reason. See, phonology has to do with the mouth, and the mouth is something that's real. It's finite. It has articulatory parameters. There are only so many things you can do, although in some African language, you wonder, boy, maybe they can do anything. I had a linguistics teacher at Indiana who studied the click languages of Africa, and there were like clicks in 7 different points of articulation in the mouth. Many of them I just couldn't do, but it's amazing what can happen. Be that as it may, we all know that there is an inventory of all sounds produced by humans. And the reason we know that is the mouth is finite and the articulatory organs within the mouth are finite. So there are only so many things you can do. Given that, it is possible to very cleverly construe a set of matrices of plus and minus features. Like you can say vowels, the cardinal vowels, e, u, and a, or the 5 big ones that so many languages have, e, a, o, and u. You can talk about them being back, plus or minus back. Now you don't need to talk about front vowels. Front vowels are simply minus back. You have high vowel e and low vowel a, but you don't need to call it a low vowel. You just call it minus high. This is, the power of dualism, right? A reduction. But the point is this: if you can come up cleverly with a set of these matrices that inside a rule will accurately predict the phonology of a language, you've described something because you've shown an order where before there was chaos. Now, what kind of truth that's getting at may be quite another question, but there's obviously something going on there because you are explaining things. Again, very simply, with the Marx and Beds example, just take something very simple. You could say that S becomes Z when the consonant before it is voiced, when it's plus voiced. Now, except for the strong Germanic things like child, children, and ox, oxen, or deer, deer, when you're coming to things that really are S, that perfectly predicts with absolute precision all of the dialects, notwithstanding, all of the standard American English sounds for the plural marker S in English, and just done with one feature, plus or minus voice. So this was so successful, it got everyone excited, and they started doing everything that way. But then the question became, how do we do this for syntax? Since I was a syntactician, I get into this lousy habit, which does exist, of using the term grammar and really meaning syntax, because obviously phonology is part of grammar, but I really meant syntax. So by the late 50s and early 60s, linguistics was described and defined as the scientific study of language. But each one of those words has its own caveat or definition. Scientific meant falsifying hypotheses to create new theories based on empirical data. Study meant we want to find explanations for why things are, not descriptions of how things are. And language meant, very specifically, I just love the cynicism of this, language is anything that has been, is now, or will be spoken by a human being. So already, although I know you know this, let me just point this out. Now we are saying we don't have to describe what whales and dolphins do. We don't have to figure out why classical Tibetan has all of those oddities in it. It's not a spoken language. It's written. So I believe there were two reasons for those strictures being put in. One was scientific in a way, since they were trying to parallel the modest successes of phonology, they wanted to keep things in natural language because that's why phonology had such success. It was based on the human voice apparatus. So they wanted to try to restrict the data for syntax to human phonation with meaningful elements. The other was very cynical. It's just that, just like any good academe, the first thing you want to do defensively, right, is narrow the scope of what you're doing. So all these things that you can't explain, you'll say, well, I'm not trying to explain those things. That's not my job. And then, you're much smarter all of a sudden. So that's good. Okay. Now, we used to think of grammar, I'm sure in school I did, grammar as being parts of speech, right? So does anyone know how many parts of speech there are in English, by the way? There's no eclair for this, by the way. I'm sorry? Too many, yes. Give that man an eclair. Very good, yeah. Well, I've heard anywhere between 8 and 10. There might be more, but this list that I love is noun, pronoun, adjective, verb, adverb, preposition, determiner, conjunction, and interjection. Interjection? Oh, sorry. Okay. Now, of course, pronouns are nouns. Adjectives actually are nouns. Verbs, okay, that's good. Adverbs are just like adjectives, they're relators. And prepositions are relators. Determiners, they're actually part of the noun phrase complex. Conjunctions, might be something. I would boil this down to 4 at the most. But we'll get into that later too. So that was one way to classify what grammar is. It's breaking everything down into one of those categories. Okay. Another notice that that's not dualistic. That's octistic or nonistic. Another way to do it is act, relator, and verb. So there could be 3 categories. In other words, functional, syntactic categories. But the categorical one with the parts of speech was much more satisfying somehow, I guess, and sold a lot of books. So for the longest time, that's what grammar was. But linguistics, as I've already said, was going for something else. They weren't trying to describe language at all. They were trying to explain it. So they wanted to be able to describe language in a way that it explains things, not simply describe it to describe it. In other words, it's not taxonomic. You don't say, oh, that's a lily, and therefore it's a lily, and you don't have to think about it anymore. I'm saying, well, this is a noun. It's a noun because there can be a determiner in front of it. And the reason the determiner is there, et cetera, et cetera. Or it inflects for the plural, and therefore, and it's a meaningful category because verbs need the nouns. Every term that was used to describe the language had to be argued for and justified rigorously and systemically as part of an explanatory matrix. So there was a big Occam's razor going on. So language became the combining and ordering of sounds for meaning. And that gets down into 5 specific words. Ordering, which is syntax, sounds, which is phonology, combining, which is morphology, in other words, the combination of meaningful elements and how they make new words, meaning, which is semantics, and then another thing, how the context or conditions for the intent of meaning are used, pragmatics. Now, key to the Chomskyan revolution in modern American linguistics, what made it so great was that they defined semantics and pragmatics straight out. As far as they were concerned, that wasn't part of language. And the reason that they did not include semantics, pragmatics is easier to understand because it's very messy and gets into psychology and sociology. But semantics, for heaven's sakes, you would think the reason for language is to convey meaning, so you'd want to do something with that, but it's too hard. That was the problem. There was no way to construct a matrix of pluses and minuses that would deal with meaning. So all of these grammatical devices that were developed between 1958 and the 80s were keyed to be used with output that would be put into a component that they had nothing to deal with. They just called it the lexicon. So they said the grammar will create all of these algebraic-like formulistic ideas about what each sentence breaks down to. And then it goes into the lexicon, and that makes it into, so we'll know, oh, well, we don't really say regardless, we say, we don't say irregardless, we say regardless. All of those things are taken into account later. They just didn't want to deal with that, which is sort of cheating in a way, I guess, but I feel for them because they were trying to make some advances, and if you bite off too much, you're just going to choke on it. So all those matrices helped skyrocket linguistics into the scientific age, made it a science, a true science that was developed along the lines of actual empirical data, but at the same time necessarily crippled it so it could never get to a real explanation of what anyone on the street would consider language, because it simply wasn't going to try to explain everything. Footnote number 1, because it could not. So from the perspective of being out of linguistics for 40 years, I never thought of this at the time because I went to, my undergrad university was basically a Chomskyan boot camp. Everyone learned it like phrases of Chairman Mao. You did not, and there was a good reason not to throw it out because there wasn't anything else that even came close to working. At least, the fallacies and the shortcomings of Chomskyan grammar were well understood. And just like a guy with a tree, he just kept hammering on. Every time they found something that didn't work, he would, he had a standard theory, an extended standard theory, an extended standard theory. It's sort of like the way quarks came about, right? They had this table of 9 and then this table of 16, but they couldn't find the 16th one. But I guess they finally did for, 1 nanosecond or something. But again, linguistics has always been hard science envious. They always wanted to be a hard science, and they could have been. I mean, the embracing of empirical data is a good thing. Going out, trying to come up with a grammar of a language by going to native speakers, recording what they're saying, doing a rigorous phonological analysis that doesn't just go to the very nice phonetic strain, but actually discovers what the phonemes are, the meaningful differences in them, and then discovering the syntactic operations on those and coming up with the grammar. That's all very scientific, but it doesn't end up producing something that anyone could say describes and predicts all and only the grammatical utterances of any language. No one's ever come up with that. So, but the reason why is they wedded themselves to the matrix system, to dualism, to this conventional reality. And I think after a while, they didn't realize that's what they were doing anymore. I think at the beginning, they saw it as a stepping stone to something that would be greater. And I must admit, it is a stepping stone, or at least could be a stepping stone to something better, something more accurate, something more embracing, something real, whatever that ends up meaning. That's a very tough word to use in this audience. But, they didn't. And I didn't realize this till I came back. I had all this trepidation coming back of 40 years of dealing with another, dare I call it a science. I guess jurisprudence is supposed to be the science of law, if there is such a thing. But it trained my brain in a totally different way. I mean, I really had trouble my first year of law school because they teach you how to think in a certain way, and it definitely isn't the way a scientist thinks. So I had a lot of resistance to that, but after 40 years of it, I, learned the game well enough, I suppose. But being then detached from the linguistics process and going back and seeing what happened 40 years later, no breakthroughs, no changes. This even hit me on my dissertation. My dissertation really was done by about 1982. When one wrote a dissertation in the 80s on a language that had to do with syntax, you came to this big fork in the road. You had to decide what theoretical system you were going to use to describe the language and then do it. So what everyone always did, of course, is adopt the syntactic theories of the professor who was the chairman of your committee. That was the only way to get by, right? And I know plenty of people, actually, it's sort of funny now since it's not me, looking at a lot of these PhD dissertations, a theory of Sora based on, relational grammar or something like that. There are all these, or lexicase, I remember, was one of them. All fine, but, there was never any agreement that any of these systems ever really was the correct approach for describing language, because none of them ever were able to manifest the minimal output constraints for being called a theory of language, which was being able to explain and predict all the grammatical and only the grammatical sentences in the language. They just weren't there. So when I went about doing my dissertation, which was on Tibetan copular verbs, which never fails to get a nervous titter from people that don't know anything about what copular verbs are. That was probably the only good thing about the title of my dissertation. I came up with my own theory because I was lucky enough, I guess, to have a dissertation chair who wasn't a syntactician. So there was no one wedded to any particular theory. So I came up with my own eclectic version, which was narrowly modeled to describe things that were honestly peculiar to Tibetan. And that's why I love Tibetan so much. Tibetan and other Bodic languages in the Tibeto-Burman family have certain grammatical features that just aren't anywhere else that I've ever seen. They're very interesting, and they definitely colored the way I looked at language, but we'll get to that in a bit. On the dualism again, on the matrices thing, one important question that I think we need to remember was always being asked, but never answered out loud, but I will answer it out loud tonight. I've formulated the question right here. The question is this: in linguistics, are we attempting to account for the structure and rules for creating well-formed grammatical sentences in the language? Or are we attempting to account for the neurobiological and sociological processing of speech with human brains as transceivers? The answer to this question is yes. So that's why no one ever answered the question. And I have friends who are linguists. We can't talk about linguistics because we're really in two different fields. We have nothing in common. In a very real sense, I don't think it's histrionic to say that we have functionally different definitions of language. So my uneasy relation with modern American syntax, I guess, can be boiled down to this. I was always aware, as I think some of my professors were not, or at least they wouldn't say it out loud. I was always aware that we were describing an unreal system. I always knew that. But what kept me going, besides my lifelong penchant for wanting to do impractical things, just ask my wife, it's the bane of her existence, is that I also knew that there was a system here. We were describing something. It was something systematic. And out of chaos, if you come up with rules that have an onto mapping with something real, the empirical data of the language, if you come up with something that shows a recurrence, shows a system, you are describing something. It may not be language, but it's something. And that was enough for me. I think Chomsky probably referred to this as autonomous syntax. Okay, there are syntactic rules that have their own sort of reality because they aren't broken. We'll get to some of those later, but that's why dualism took such indefatigable root in modern American syntax, because they never went beyond the field of data that would force one to go beyond dualism. They just had dualism in effect, those matrices of plus and minus features, both syntactic and phonological. They made their universe those phenomena that they could account for using those tools. And that's simply never changed. If you want to leave the room now, I understand completely. Okay, so now we have a grammar that clearly needs to not only explain how sentences are grammatically formed, but there's a question about how you're going to go about structuring the grammar. Now, this is where transformational grammar comes in with Chomsky. And again, it's as old as 1957 in syntactic structures. But not only has no theory, in essence, if you're flexible enough, really gone beyond this system, they've never done better than it either. I'm not defending it. I'm just really lambasting linguistics as a whole, I guess. So the theory of grammar that Chomsky came up with, and it was an interesting one. It was completely consistent with his one insight. Chomsky had one golden present to modern linguistics that no one can ever take away from him, and it was fundamental and changed everything. And that is linguistics needs to be explanatory, not descriptive. That was wonderful. But then when you go about describing how you're going to explain things, that's where all hell breaks loose. So his concept of transformational grammar, for those lucky ones of you who don't know, is that you have phrase structure rules, transformational rules, and then some sort of third category, which I'll get to in a minute. So phrase structure rule will be something like this. S goes to NPVP. That's a common first phrase structure rule. All that means is for a grammatical sentence, you need a noun phrase and a verb phrase. So a noun phrase could be John, a verb phrase could be rules. John rules, okay? And everything else. So we won't get into the minutia. And again, the more specific I get, the more flawed the system becomes. So we don't want to do that. But they'll generate, by these phrase structural rules, they'll generate all sorts of sentences that you will easily acclaim as good grammatical English sentences, like John hit the dog. Fine. Now, what about the dog was hit by John? Okay. You can either generate another rule that accounts for that phrase structure, which we know in, grammar school is the passive, right? You can come up with one that describes the passive, or you can be explanatory, you can be innovative, you can be insightful, and you can start layering yet another crypto dualism by saying, actually, there is a rule that changes John hit the dog to the dog was hit by John. You come up with a rule that is an algebraic code. So it's like X plus V plus Y goes to Y plus bin or B. This gets into the morphology part. That isn't the focus of this. Plus verb plus by plus X. And what they've done, however imperfectly, is actually something very exciting. They're saying that there's a connection between the sentence, John hit the dog, and the dog was hit by John. What's the connection? Well, as native American English speakers, you could just say, well, they describe the same reality. The dog ends up being hurt and John is a bully. Fine. But grammatically, they're saying that these two processes are related. And what they're also saying is they're creating a new kind of dualism, deep structure and surface structure. So they're saying the deep structure of John hit the dog and the dog was hit by John. The deep structure is the same. The deep structure is allowing for all the other crap they put in there. John hit the dog. And then there's a transformational rule that takes the deep structure of John hit the dog and maps it mechanically, very algebraically, into the dog was hit by John. Now you can see this as some sort of abstruse play on, making, actually Chomsky was a mathematician, so you can see a lot of that coming out in there. But this does make an exciting claim that there are two layers of language, deep structure and surface structure. This goes back to Prod School's Ferdinand de Saussure, too. Of course, he said it in French, but he talked about langue and parole. Okay, langue is this language that everyone knows about, but no one knows exactly how to explain it, some sort of system up in the air. And parole, which we usually think of as meaning word, is the actual spoken form. So even back then, there was some understanding that there might be some sort of abstract thing out there that had a system that was different from what actually happened when you said the words. And that abstract system was deep structure, and then the actual words was surface structure. So you needed a finite, predictable set of rules that mapped those surface deep structures onto surface structures. So they went about doing that. But then they decided, wait a minute, let's not lose sight of the prize here. We want this to be meaningful too. So they started constraining the types of rules they had. They needed to be what they called elegant. They can't be ad hoc. They have to be motivated. They have to be economical, right? So these were ways of trying to reintroduce some sort of non-arbitrary algebraic manipulation of features to come up with something that really captured the soul, dare I say, of the language. And of course, in this, they failed miserably, but at least they had their eyes on a sort of a prize. So what were these, I would call them output constraints? They're things, what they wanted to do is have deep structures with rules, transformational rules, printing onto surface structures, which then went through a filter that they called output constraints. This was going to solve all of their problems, and they were hoping other scientists would come along and help them. But one part of the output constraints they were really believing in was this concept of universal grammar. They felt that there were things in grammar that no matter whether you were speaking some tribal language in Paraguay or Cockney English in London, that there were certain things in the syntax of the language that always held true. They were grammatical universals. Now, if they found things like this is truly exciting because this sounds very scientific. This is like finding the atom or something, right? This is great. So they did come up with some universals. I can give you, I think there were maybe 45 of them or something. I can give you the ones that are more easily accessible and you'll understand them from your own knowledge of different languages. A lot of them have to do with the underlying structure, array of elements. Okay, we all know about subjects, verbs, and objects, at least if the verbs are transitive, right? So English is what they call an SVO language, right? Subject first, then verb, then the object. Now, does that mean the subject always has to come first? We know that's not true. In questions, the verb comes first, right? Are you ready? But the point is, again, going back to deep structure and surface structure, is you are ready is the deep structure. If you want to make it a question, you do the transformational rule for making questions and you front the verb and put it in there, and then you have are you ready? So the underlying structure for English in terms of cybernetics of flow of information is subject, verb, object. In languages like Japanese or Tibetan, it's very obviously subject, object, verb. Again, subject to the same caveats. That's the way it goes. The first universal of Greenberg's universal is that languages that have an underlying structure, subject, object, verb, always have postpositions. They never have prepositions. This is actually true. And you can think of any of your language, Japanese postpositions, Tibetan postpositions, English prepositions, Hawaiian, which is VSO, okay, prepositions. So that's great. That's interesting. But is it explanatory? Really, it's just another description, isn't it? It's like a fun discovery. Oh, this is interesting. To make it explanatory, you have to come up with a theory of language that explains why it's a universal. Okay. Now, there are different ways to do this. You can come up with different meta theories of language. I think universal grammar really led to the concretization, which is an ironic way to put it, of the meta theory of language. So, thinking of a sentence as a solar system, you've got the verb as the sun, and all of the noun phrases around it, whether they're adverbial, prepositional phrases, or the subject or the object, they're all rotating around the sun. Okay? So here's to hit, or just hit, and here's John, and here's the dog. Okay? So John's over here. When you freeze the turning of the solar system, John's over here. Here's the verb, and dog's here. So here's English: John and dog. Okay. So the reason the verb is the sun is that all of the planets relate to the sun by traveling along their own idiosyncratic path in the gravity well that's created by the sun. In the same way, every verb creates its own gravity well. It's like governance, right? Some verbs require 2 or 3 objects. Some verbs require a prepositional phrase. We saw that in Tibetan this morning. So the fact is that the information that slaves to each noun phrase comes from the rays of the sun. So the sun is there shining on that planet that's the noun. Prepositions or postpositions are those relators that construe and modify the sunshine from the sun. So if it's like John hit the dog in the office, okay, office is out here, it's a noun. But in has to be in front of office because English has prepositions. But the reason why it's in front of office is because the sun has to go through in to understand what the sun's relationship with office is. Okay? In a language like Japanese or Tibetan, where it's verb final, it's reversed. Here's in the office, but it's over on this side because the verb is final. So all of a sudden now, this same preposition, this same information like the word in is over here, moderating the relationship between the sun verb and the planet noun. But look where it is. It's after the noun, right? It's the same situation. It's always in between the sun and the planet, right? It's like a moon. So that's why they have, this explains why it's not a coincidence that all SOV languages are postposition and all SVO languages are prepositions. So you need to build a theory of language that has some sort of meta-theoretical layer to it that can set up a model that's explanatory. I don't know that anyone's ever actually done that, but that's one way of doing it. I'm not saying it's the only way. So given all of that, we now have what I call, and apologies to everyone that knows even the slightest thing about Buddhism, my linguistic conjure. Okay. So I have 3 elements to grammar. You have the phrase structure rules. The phrase structure rules are the rules that tell the elements, the meaningful elements of the language, how things are done, how they must behave, the rules of practice. So that's Vinaya. That's the first part of linguistic conjure. Second part are the transformational rules. They're the ones that tell the stories, that tell the actions. They describe the way that the elements array with each other in charting different actions and sort of give templates and models for it. So it's like Jataka stories or something like the Sutra. And then these universal meta-theoretical things are like the Abhidharma. They're the meta-theoretical approach to language. All 3 of these need to be together for a successful model of language. Successful meaning explanatory, right? And as far as I know, that's never been created. How are we doing on time? 10 minutes, okay. So I've talked till you're all dead about linguistics. What about dualism? Okay, here's where I'm really on shaky ground. I'm only going to define dualism as I define it. I'm sure I'll do violence to Buddhist precepts, but I have a definition of dualism here: the systematic discernment of material phenomena as bipartite. Every part of that is important. It has to be systematic. It has to be discerning. The phenomena have to be material, not immaterial, and it needs to always come out in 2. That's why the plus-minus matrix was the big thing with linguistics. So this discernment, which I think is sometimes used in different translations of some of the Dharma language. Discernment, discrimination, the good form of discrimination, not the one that's illegal. They all go back to the same Indo-European root, krei, K-R-E-I, krei. Okay. Krei means to sift or put through a sieve. So the whole idea is parsing out, right? So this is also the root of words like, for instance, excrement. Thank you very much. It's the krei in excrement because you are parsing out the bad part of your body and putting it out. It's in the word for secret. Say, self, and krei, self-sifting, sifting out and keeping to yourself the things you don't want to share with someone else. Okay. So in all these situations that I just mentioned, the rather graphic ones, they're bipartite in nature, right? Secret and open, crap and stuff you're using for energy. So it all comes down really to categorization. And these categories are always bipartite. They didn't always used to be bipartite. Sometimes they had three or more, but linguists started realizing that they were missing generalizations unless they made sure that every tree graph always broke into two. That's really what X-bar syntax was all about, another Chomsky invention to save himself from some of his enemies. So this categorization, this breaking down, this accusing, right, in the agora, this breaking down of things into categories is absolutely a part of dualism and absolutely a part of what makes modern explanatory linguistics work to the extent it works. So in terms of thinking of it with respect to religion and philosophy, I suppose worship always goes toward unity, but explanation always seeks contrast, right? So even when I think I was talking to Jonathan today after Tibetan class, right? That I said it was ironic, but I don't think it's ironic at all, that even in Buddhism, when they're describing the either, shunyata or any sort of unity, or in Kabbalah, when they're talking about the oneness of God, there's no way to do that except in dualistic terms. So actually, I thought if I had the time, I would just mention, since I mentioned Kabbalah and everyone's here is a Buddhist, of course, that probably means half of you are Jews too. I don't know, but the theory of creation of man, one of the Kabbalistic well-known creation theories for man, was that God was everything. Obviously, that wasn't a theory. They were very sure about that. Made all the papers. So the problem was there was no space for man, right? So what God did was, as it were, contracted. He contracted to make space to put man in, so that man would be not God, outside the system. This is something they later took back, by the way. They get very dodgy about all of this. But and then they started articulating God's presence in terms of 10 little spheres, and all hell broke loose after that. It got very, very messy. But the main point is, once again, to create something with consciousness, something that could be an actor with free will, which was very important in Judaism. They had to create this systematic bifurcation, God and not God. If it was all part of God, then any human action was meaningless. It had to be through the human. So anyway, just another sketch of how dualism seems to run rampant, even in systems of philosophy or faith that are very clear and uniform in their embrace of a solidarity or a unity of a Godhead. Actually, I think artificial intelligence goes that way too, right? Everything is a plus or a minus, on or off. That's a basic bifurcation. So the lie is that you can create the competence of a human through a performance based on huge amounts of data at phenomenally fast speeds in a very uncannily small area. They keep ramping up computing speed, but are they approaching thought, or are they just approaching some facsimile of thought, right? I mean, You can go on into the night on that one, and I'm sure there are camps on both sides. But the only reason I'm bringing it up, because it's otherwise pretty bootless, no one's ever going to come up with a chicken and egg on that, is that it's exactly the same problem within linguistics. And linguistics always came down on the side of this is the competence. This is human competence. It's not just performance, it's the competence. But they could never really prove it. How do they prove it? They would prove it if they could ever create a grammar from these rules with the transformations under the universal constraints and all the output constraints that were motivated, made sense, weren't ad hoc, were very elegant, and could describe all and only the grammatical sentence of a human language. But they just haven't done that. So what was that? Ah, okay. Well, okay. Yes. So this, oh, yes. Okay. Well, I was hoping to avoid this, but what you see before you, gentle hearers, was my own fakakta attempt to try to bridge this gap and come up with my own eclectic theory that would explain in a more elegant way the way at least Tibetan syntax works. Now, the first thing I had to do, of course, is talk about modern spoken Tibetan, because that's the only proper. I mean, I can't do this for the classical literary language because it's not a language under the strictures of modern linguistics. But all I did was, I think I had two principles which I liked and I think were instructive, and maybe with more work they might go somewhere. But I had two principles. One is I called things what they appear to be, and I kept everything in tightly phrased, non-dynamic, dualistic pairs. So the first thing I noticed was that there were two basic copular expressions: a verb that denotes existence, an existential copula, that's like yundu, and then ones that are equational, like yin and re, etc. In the grammar of the colloquial language, it's really more the literary, modern literary language, because all hell breaks loose when you get into evidentiality, meritivity, egophoricity, all of these nice little shades. That's a competing system that is placed on top of this fundamental one. But the only way to do linguistics and syntax is to take off all these layers and describe the layers layer by layer. There is a layer of modern colloquial syntax where every well-phrased, complete autonomous sentence ends in a copular verb that is tied with a main verb through one of two nominalizers, a ba nominalizer or a gi, a genitive, basically nominalizer. I think there are many people who think that the gi in there, like yugi, like down here. Okay, this sentence, you have nye lama tong ba yin, nga lama tong gi yu. I think there are many who consider that gi not to be a genitive particle. And they say, well, how can it be a genitive? A genitive ties two nouns together, and that's a verb. But I think the whole point, at least my analysis, was simply this. There is something inherently dualistic about having two copular verbs, existential and equational. What is it? Existential verbs always must take only one argument. If you have more than one argument, you have more than one sentence. Something exists, period. An equational copula must have two and only two arguments. A equals B. You can have more, but if you do, it's either a compound noun phrase, and those are actually under A, or you have a subordinate clause or something like that, and it goes on and on. Using that simple heuristic that there are only two main super sentences in every modern Tibetan well-formed sentence, one that ends in a verb that requires a copula that requires one argument or one that requires two, then you note that ba, this PA particle, only nominalizes verbs. And gi, because it's a genitive particle, can only nominalize other nouns or things that are nouns, for instance, sentences, because sentences act like nouns. Once you do that, you can start rewriting the phrase structure of all of these Tibetan sentences, coming down in a way that seems very crass and almost arrogantly arbitrary. But the fact of the matter is, under this scheme, there are different things that are explained that weren't explained otherwise. This system explains, and you'll just have to take my word for this right now, split ergativity in Tibetan. One of the things that drew me to Tibetan was I was told, and I'm sure on some level it must be true, that the subject of a transitive verb in the past tense takes the instrumental marker, let's say, but not in the present or the future. That's called split ergativity, because ergativity was another name for the agent. Right? This model explains why that's the case. It actually explains it. It doesn't just account for it. It explains why it is, because of the structure of the sentence and the bifurcation between the subject and the predicate verb phrase, whether it's under one argument or two. It also explains why you can have the negative ma before the main verb or before the copula. Sometimes you can't have it both ways. This model explains why it's one way or why it's the other. I'm terribly truncating this for a variety of reasons. Part is because I know a lot of you people out there know more about Tibetan than I do, and I'm not about to give you a way to refute me, but also because of time and boredom. But let's not miss the point. The point is, this elementary endeavor, to the extent it has any worth at all, is actually doing the work of linguistics. It is explaining in a non-arbitrary way. It is accounting for data that otherwise were unaccounted for before. No grammar of Tibetan with the ba yin, gi ye, gi re. No one ever does anything other than tell you this is the way you do it. This theory explains why it's done that way, and it accounts for how subordination works, how negative placement works, why ergativity is only found in the past, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So to suspend disbelief, let's just say, if all that is true, this actually is a road for coming up with a model for how you would make a grammar of a language. Now, I'll point out the most obvious infirmity right now. The strongest point of this theory, which is the one that really makes it work, is that every sentence has either one or two arguments. Okay, that will only work in a verb final language that has copular verbs. I think I could probably apply this to modern Japanese. I'm not sure, but you couldn't apply it to English because English is just, I won't say it hangs differently. And you want a grammar, you want a theory of language that accounts for all human speech. But at least describing one might be a starting point. So that's pretty much it, folks. I'll drink my water. And since there are no questions, we'll just.
So I just wanted to know what do you think about the ki construction? How does that fit into this model?
Right. Okay. Yubare is, yeah. Actually, we can talk later. I could actually give you my dissertation, and then you'll be sorry you asked this question. But basically, that's a subordination. You've got a nominalization of a lower sentence that ends in ye, and then an upper sentence that ends in re. So you have a ye, an existential one that has only one argument, and then you have another one on top of that with the re, with the ba. See, the ba will nominalize the noun, which is the sentence, and then up there. So yubare is going to be, I like these periphrases because they give us sort of an English hearer's stab at what's going on syntactically. A yubare would be something like, the existence of this is this thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it gets a little more complicated. But actually, I guess I should have mentioned this because these brutishly crazy quasi-English renditions are very good at explaining what I think's going on. This one here is, by me is or was a llama seeing, whereas The present one is there exists a me-lama-seeing. There's a lot to unpack in there, but a lot of it, I mean, actually, if you could go with these as English translations, it would explain a lot about, for instance, why you don't have an ergative marking on I here. Because it's a cluster with a cognate object that actually incorporates it in. It doesn't have a space for the ergative. It's all part of an amalgam. But anyway, that's getting way into the sticks. But yes, yobare is a complex expression that actually, that's another thing that this theory explains, is why yobare ends up meaning what it means. I have to say one thing. I said it before, but I'll say it again, especially for anyone that knows colloquial Tibetan or speaks it at all. This entire structure is not completely, but drastically altered by another set of output constraints that features unique pragmatic meanings to different concatenations of copular verbs. I think they're easily seen as relatable to these underlying ones, but things have changed. For instance, you can use du just to mean that you saw it yourself. That doesn't come out of this grammar at all. But I think it's relatable to it. I could give you a diachronic analysis of a set of transformational rules over time that got it to there, which makes the choice of du for that to appear non-arbitrary, but I couldn't do any more than that. But modern Tibetan is a lot more complicated than just this. This is just one striation. But thank you for the question. It's important. Yeah. Yeah? Oh. Uh-oh. This is where all hell breaks loose. This is my Tibetan teacher who knows much more about Tibetan than I.
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you very much. It was very fascinating. I have no idea about language. I didn't know how complicated it is, actually.
Oh.
One thing is, this kind of is all kind of very modern day colloquial Tibetan, right? It has evolved from something for which your theory wouldn't work, I think. Yeah, the fascinating idea is, how does language evolve? Does it evolve in a way that it suddenly develops new structures, new rules? I'm sure there's a lot of theory about that.
I actually have an answer to that because I'm irresponsible. No linguist would ever answer that question because they're saying nobody knows. But the whole point of my dissertation actually was not a synchronic, but a diachronic. It was a developmental analysis of the copular verb. So in the same way that a phrase structure and transformational grammar of a modern language is supposed to show at one point in time, a language fully formed at one point in time, how it works, I believe the same structures used differently can show, in other words, these changes over time change according to certain physical and psychological rules as well. And I think those can be explained, some better than others, but yeah. No, I agree.
And you talked, I found it very fascinating, the deep meaning and the surface meaning, right?
Right.
Basically, the deep meaning, did I understand it correctly, is inexpressible. Because if you express it, it becomes the surface meaning.
Yes, that's, yeah.
So we
That's
have
a nice way of melding, yes.
There's something inexpressible, which is kind of our daily life, our whole life is basically inexpressible, is the deep meaning. But we only, it's not, I don't know, how can you even think about it, right?
Yeah.
How can you even think about it? But still, if you think and formulate it, it becomes the surface meaning.
Right.
This is actually, if you think about it, that's something very fascinating.
Yes, I really like what you've said. I think you might have inadvertently ennobled the process a little more. The linguists be very careful to say deep structure and surface structure. They're afraid of the word meaning because they know they can't do that. But your analogy holds completely, and it's something I wanted to tease out. So I'm glad you saw that.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Oh, look at the time. Oh.
Okay, so I read Chomsky's syntactic structures.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. But I read it like maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could refresh my memory a bit here that the significance of the phrase, if I remember it correctly, colorless green ideas sleep furiously.
Right.
I was wondering if you could refresh my memory about the significance of that phrase
Sure.
and how it might the theory around that phrase, how the consequences of that
Yeah.
might affect how we approach learning a language.
That's a wonderful question. It's so good, I should have actually built it into my presentation. So it's I think, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. It's something like that, but it's not exactly that. It doesn't sound quite right, but it's the idea. Okay. That's an important concept on a couple of levels, especially for this audience. Panini's grammar would not have allowed that sentence to be generated in Sanskrit. It would have been ungrammatical. But it is canonically grammatical under Chomskyan analysis because he very proudly says, I don't care if it doesn't make any sense or if it's mutually contradictory. I'm saying the adverb is where the adverb's supposed to be. The morphology is correct. It's got an ly on the end. The subject is marked in the nominative. The object is marked in the dative. The verb dream can take this object. Everything works fine. Whether it makes any sense or not, that's somebody else's problem, not mine. That's really, that again is part of his so-called autonomous syntax, that there are material generalizations to be understood from that level of analysis. And indeed, you have to admit, green ideas sleep furiously. On some level, we all know that's grammatical, right? We all know that that doesn't make sense, but it's following every grammatical rule we know. And there's some sort of a facet to language with a capital L that should be able to capture that competence of the human that knows that that is grammatical, even though it doesn't make sense. I think that's what the significance of it is. Does that make sense? I hate to use that term again.
It does make sense, but I have a follow-up.
So
So I took a linguistics course as an undergrad.
Otherwise, you'd never read syntactic structures.
Read syntactic structures, right? But actually, syntactic structures was on a list of 100 top books to read before you die. Back in the early 2000s or so.
Right.
So it was still around at the time. But the follow-up question is that the way my linguistics instructor kind of explained it is that there's a division in linguistics between people who believe that when we learn a language, whether we learn it from when we're infants or we learn it when we're older, that the Chomskyan methods that we learn grammar and we learn how to parse words together to form sentences, right? The way my linguistics professor said that the opposing camp says that when we learn language, we learn memorized phrases and we put them together.
Oh, no, that was, I mean, I hate to say anything in open public this decisive, but I think that theory was soundly debunked. That's the Skinnerian hypothesis. That's what made Chomsky famous. They even had a Time article that said Skinner debunked, right? Yeah.
Right. But I was wondering if you could explain a bit more because as I've learned languages and my experience teaches me that you learn the language through grammar.
Yeah.
But in theory. But in practice, when I end up speaking languages, I find myself speaking in memorized phrases.
Interesting.
And I learned Chinese, or I can't speak Chinese now, but I studied in Beijing for a time. And they taught a non-Chomsky method where they taught you memorized phrases.
Yes.
Right.
I could understand that because Chinese, more than many other languages that I know, end up having these surface constraints where you need to cleave to certain specific phrases.
Right.
I remember my brother, who speaks Chinese fluently, was just decimated because he would be over there speaking and they'd tell him, you speak very good Chinese, it's very grammatical, but we just wouldn't say it that way,
So I mean, when learning Tibetan here, we learn it in grammar, right?
Yeah.
And we learn how to speak by putting together grammar syntax.
Right.
But can you explain more thoroughly why the whole idea of speaking in phrases, memorized phrases, has been thoroughly debunked?
Sure. It basically boils down to this. The Chomskyan insight that debunked Skinner was that it starts from a premise that actually I've debated till everyone's blue in the face over many beers, that there are an infinite number of grammatical sentences in any language. if you believe that, I don't actually believe that, because the only way it can be infinite is you have continually nested relative clauses, like this was the cat that ate the rat that ate the mouse, and again, there are constraints in the human brain that will only let you, but practically infinite number of grammatical utterances, and there's no way to generate that capacity using rote memorization. It just can't be done. I mean, it's that simple. Even in Chinese, it's a much more narrowly circumscribed set of phenomena for the memorized. It could be Chengyu or something like that, right? But it's not down at the grammatical level. It's not that, oh no, when we talk about these emotions, we have to put the verb first. It's not stuff like that. It'll be some classical epithet or some sort of particular phrase, right? But the main point not to be obscured is this. You bet that you learn your language through grammar. It might not be the grammar in your grammar book, but there has to be a system. Whether it's innate or not is yet another set of unanswerable questions. But, you know, Chomsky believed in this language acquisition device, the LAD, right, for a long time. I don't know if he still does. He's still alive. He's almost 100 now. He was born in 1928. So watch this space. He may still be here. Only the good die young, right? But, oh, I didn't say that. No, he's a great man, just not much of a politician. But I digress. There is something in your brain when you are hearing your parents speak that organizes the data in a way that you quickly become able to fashion your own novel utterances. It's seen all the time. It's done all the time. Everyone knows this to be the case. It used to be thought, and I don't know if it's still thought or not, but one thought about the difference between human language and animal language is that animals can't communicate recursion. In other words, they can't have relative clauses. I don't know if they found that gets so dicey because I'm not sure how they know what they know about what the animal's saying. And I'm don't have an axe to grind. I'm not so pro-human that I don't want animals not to be able to speak or communicate in something called language. That doesn't matter to me. That's fine. But you definitely are able to form relative clauses, passives, things like that. You hear your parents say some of them. You extract a rule from the model and you create your own. Surely you must agree that you've said things that your parents have never said. Let's not say what they are, but we know you've said things your parents would never say, right? So otherwise you'd just be saying, I need to get a job all the time or something like that, right? And so yeah, it's just a hard reality. And since we know on some level that has to be true, there's this insatiable appetite to find out what that is. And that's what triggers all of this. And it's so ridiculously intractable that the only way they could go about it was to form these matrices of plus minus features, both phonological and syntactic. And whether it's just a bridge to a better world or not, they've never gotten past that. Yeah. Whoever. Yeah. Yeah, she has a mic.
I have a mic. First of all, thank you for being here. That talk was great. My question is, so to what extent does your theory differ from the Chomskyan theory of phrase structure, or does it at all?
Oh. Yeah, it definitely, I think in philosophy, it differs. I mean, I did create phrase structure grammar and transformational rules because that's the only way I could, I was pretty uncreative. But the one thing I did, which isn't very linguistic-y, is I really tailored the meta theory of the grammar to things that were peculiar to Tibetan. This idea of the copula being either existential or, as a matter of fact, there might only be, in terms of grammar and dualism, there might only be one copula in Tibetan, and that's the existential one. So an existential copula is either plus or minus singular. If it's asserting the existence of one thing, it's the existential copula. If it's asserting that the existence of this is the existence of this, those are two existential copulas, but they're equating each other. So equational copulas could be a plus minus function of existential. The copula is existence. That's why, in English, I was always taught, and I think it's true, that if you only have one word in a sentence, it has to be a verb. This has a lot to do with what you think a sentence is, but like go. Okay, that's a verb, one sentence. You can't say computer. I mean, you can say computer in some sort of context. It may seem to be a sentence, but it isn't an autonomous sentence, right? In Tibetan, I think it's the other way around. I mean, I've even heard people say, probably not knowing what they're talking about, saying that Tibetan is all nouns. There are no verbs in Tibetan, they're only nouns. But the fact of the matter is, if you have a copula-rich underlying phrase structure grammar, nouns are always possible as sentences because the very existence of a noun in a dualistic system predicates existence. If you say board, or screen, that doesn't make sense unless there is a screen. But if you say go, that's going to be marked with the imperative, which already marks trivially with 0 or with some other attribute qualities of who's saying it and who has been told to do it. It's the verb has to carry that information somehow. So I think I was like a politician. I think I turned your question into my own statement, but did I answer you in there somewhere? Okay. Thank you for saying yes.
I think we have time for one more question.
You said in the exclamation "damn." In English, it can. That's one of those 10 parts of speech, right? That's an interjection, right? I think it is in English, right? In other words, may God damn this thing is what that's short for, right? Yes, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And again, Chomsky very neatly sidesteps all of that, right? I think in syntactic structures days, he was saying it was irrelevant. This is, people who try to figure this stuff out, they're stupid. After the overwhelming evidence that that's very short-sighted, he just says, well, that's not our enterprise. That's not what we're doing. We'll leave it to others to do that. But unfortunately, that might be the tail wagging the dog, right? Yeah. You villain? Oh. Yeah. Oh. No. Right. Well, actually, Garrett, now that you bring that up, there was a very popular form of transformational grammar with preformative sentences where they would say things like "you villain." The deep structure for that is, I say to you that you are a villain. And that is exciting to me because when you start implying that those superstructures are in there, that's very much like the Tibetan copular system. That's one way that my Fakakta analysis might actually be relevant to something like English. But it's assuming so much, it's very hard to. The only way that you have to justify those things. You can't just put it in there and say it works, right? You have to show that there's some grammatical reflex that depends on that being there. One way that comes out is this so-called ungrammaticality of saying, happily, I don't have to go to class tomorrow. That's supposed to be ungrammatical because happily is an adverb. Adverbs modify verbs. And the only verb in that sentence is go. And you're not talking about going happily. Happily is like a sentential level adverb. You can make that work if you have this superstructure. I say to you that it is happy that, then it's grammatical. And after all, since everyone talks that way anyway, that's another big thing about linguistics. We're not prescriptive, right? We're actually trying to account for what happens. You need to account for why native speaker hearers see that, feel that that's grammatical. And that's the way to do that. So that might be something. If I only had the time to do this, I'm working on my Tibetan all the time. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. No. I don't know much about the Ashtadhyayi. I know it made the news not too long ago, didn't it? Like about a year ago or something. Someone had finally decoded one fragment that made this seeming agrammatical thing in the grammar work or something. No, it was really a limited anecdotal thing because David brought up something that made sense to put at that time, that Panini, bless him, really went all out to integrate semantics into a theory of grammar, something that, modern linguists just simply they can't do. They just can't do it. But Panini had something going for him. I mean, this may be almost more political than scientific, sorry, but I think his work ended up defining what Sanskrit was. And Sanskrit, to some extent, became not so much a natural language anymore, but a product of those rules. I think he started just trying to describe something that was real, and it's a monumental intellectual achievement. There's no question about it. And no one's come close to that either. But there were 4,000 rules, too, that might flunk the elegance test. You want something that's much more economic than 4,000 rules, right? But still, could I do it? No. My hat's off to him. There you go. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Sure.
Kinkley. That was very entertaining.